Welcome to everybody on the call here. I'm Ryan Hanley from Political Science at Boston College. And on behalf of my colleagues at BC, I have to say I'm delighted to be able to host and welcome our featured speaker here today for this afternoon's History of Political Thought Consortium workshop, which Jeff has done such a great job of putting together here. Our speaker today is Hugh Liebert. Hugh is Associate Professor of American Politics at the United States Military Academy in West Point. Hugh teaches there courses in political philosophy, American politics, and civil military relations. And he's the author or editor of 6 books, including the very fine Plutarch's Politics, published, I think, 2016 by Cambridge, which was an award winner. It won the Delba Winthrop Award. Hugh is also a holder of a PhD and an MA from the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago and a BA from Harvard. He's been hard at work for some time writing a book on Gibbon, Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, with the title Religion Around Gibbon, which I believe is scheduled to appear later this year. Is that right, Hugh?
Hopefully, we'll see.
Yes, at the mercy of editors and copy editors. But in any case, today's paper is drawn from a chapter of that work. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Hugh Liebert.
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. And thanks everyone for coming out on a Friday afternoon. It's really nice to see some old friends and old teachers in the audience. So the last time I spoke in the Boston College Political Theory workshop, as Ryan mentioned, it was connected to this first book, Plutarch's Politics. It was back in April 2016. It wasn't quite out, I think, when I came to the workshop. Today I'm here to speak about Gibbon's Christianity, which is actually the new title of the book. I need to update my online stuff. Which is also not quite out, as Ryan mentioned. It'll be out soon, hopefully. And I've given you a chapter from that work. At the risk of seeming a little bit self-involved up front, I'd like to explain how those two projects relate to one another, what Plutarch has to do with Gibbon. And then I'll give you a little sketch of the Gibbon book so you can see how this chapter that you've read fits into the overall argument. But just in case the relationship between Plutarch and Gibbon wasn't what you had in the front of your mind when you logged in today, I'd like to give you what the Army, what West Point calls a bottom line up front, or a bluff, B-L-U-F. This is probably as good a time as any to mention, too, as employees of the federal government have to do, that you're just going to get my opinions on Plutarch and Gibbon and what follows, not the official teaching of the Department of Defense, U.S. Military Academy, and so on. So I've given you my disclaimer. So anyway, my bluff, though. My basic argument in the Gibbon book and the chapter you've read is that Gibbon's account of Christianity is more sophisticated and sympathetic than is normally understood. On my reading, one of the most interesting things Gibbon does in The Decline and Fall is adapt explanations of the Roman Republic's rise to the rise of a new spiritual republic. In Gibbon's account, Christian priests take on the role of Roman legions. Roman polytheism takes the place of the decadent Eastern empires that enabled the Roman Republic's expansion. Gibbon's account of Christianity's rise is secular and skeptical, to be sure, but it's not at bottom contemptuous. So that's the basic scholarly argument that I'm trying to make. In other words, an argument about how we should understand this wonderful book. The argument is of more than scholarly interest, though, for 2 reasons. First, this approach to Gibbon makes available to us a theory of how political bodies rise and fall that I think is still viable, still has some purchase for us. And the second reason I think this is valuable is that my book paints a picture of Gibbon himself that can teach us something about how to live well. In The Decline and Fall and the autobiography, Gibbon presents himself as a philosophical historian. And I'm going to say more in a second about what I think he means by that. But I think one of the interesting upshots of this work I've been doing on Gibbon is that Gibbon helps us to see how philosophy and history can go together in a way that neither philosophers nor historians tend to appreciate. So that's my bluff. Now I'm going to say a word about Gibbon and Plutarch to start. It was in Richmond on the 15th of April, 2011, as I sat musing on a famous passage in Gibbon's memoirs, while surrounded by students of leadership studies, sipping lattes and speaking of law school, that the idea of writing on Gibbon's Decline and Fall first started to my mind. I had recently completed a manuscript on Plutarch's lives. What impressed me in Plutarch, what interested me, was the question of what happened to political philosophy in a post-classical setting. Socrates developed political philosophy when the polis was still autonomous and vital, And for all of the tension between the lives of the philosopher and the citizen, the city called forth passions and arguments, particularly in the young, that philosophy seemed at once to rely on and to transcend. But Plutarch's situation was different. The polis of Plutarch's day had been subject to a distant monarch who ruled over an empire, not a republic. The natural stimulants of political passion had all but vanished, and many of the wisest Greeks and Romans had fled political life for lives of private contemplation. Plutarch stood athwart that tendency. He didn't exactly yell stop, but he did live and write in such a way as to illuminate an alternative path. Plutarch's greatest achievement was the Parallel Lives, a literary form that arranged competitions between ambitious statesmen and cast the reader as a judge of those competitions. The hero of those lives, I discovered, was not Socrates, but Lycurgus. It was Lycurgus who, quote, set in parallel in order to theorize about the difference in lives and regimes. That's a quote from the life of Lycurgus. So the basic argument of the Plutarch book was that Plutarch acted the part of a literary Lycurgus, setting statesmen in parallel to learn about the soul and the regime. The intent of that project was not so much to promote philosophy, but to sustain within otherwise inhospitable climates the soil in which both philosophy and statesmanship could grow. In short, to sustain the city, even when rival political forms had come into ascendance. So among the lessons I learned while working on Plutarch, two really stand out. First, I learned that it's possible to draw too starkly this juxtaposition between interpreting an author's work in its own terms and interpreting the work in its context. Plutarch is one of many canonical authors who represents to us their own lives and their political situation. And they make it possible for us to attend to context without reducing the work to an unwitting expression of its own times. The second big lesson I took from that work on Plutarch was that he helped me rethink, I think, a little bit the relationship between classical and post-classical politics. And he in particular cast the historical problem of Christianity in a new light. Plutarch took no notice of Christianity, but he was quite attentive to the growing weakness of the world, as Machiavelli put it. For Plutarch, it was the Roman Empire, not Christianity, that fundamentally altered political conditions and made it desirable to recast some of the classical expressions of political philosophy. Now, viewing the empire through Plutarch's eyes made me eager to see it through the eyes of Edward Gibbon. I wanted the record of how Plutarch's world became our own, and Gibbon, with this great ambitious sweep that he has, promised to guide me along that path. I was aware that Gibbon's history began with the Antonines, Plutarch's emperors, and continued through the century following 1453, when the fall of Constantinople swept scribes and scholars west into Europe and touched off the rebirth of antiquity. Gibbon's reputation as a skeptic colored my initial reading of him. I expected essentially an interlude story in which Christianity defined a dark age to be left behind as much as possible so that the moderns could converse freely with the ancients. What I expected to find determined what I found until I was stopped short by the famous passage from Gibbon's memoirs to which I've already playfully alluded. Let me read to you Gibbon's final version of that famous passage, and it's one that he reworked several times as he redrafted his memoirs. They never quite finished. This is the passage. It was at Rome on the 15th of October, 1764, as I sat musing amidst the ruins of the Capitol, while the barefooted friars were singing vespers in the temple of Jupiter, that the idea of writing the decline and fall of the city first started to my mind. So there's a lot to be said about that passage, and a lot has been said, including by scholars who don't think it ever really happened. But what most struck me about it, as I sat sipping my own latte in that Richmond coffee shop, was that Gibbon had constructed a story of a particular sort to explain the genesis of the decline and fall. He had written a conversion story. From Paul's conversion in Acts to Augustine's in the Confessions to John Wesley's at Aldersgate, the conversion story typically turned on a point in time that divided the speaker's present from a quite different past. It was first and foremost a religious phenomenon, since the suddenness and severity of the change suggested that higher powers were involved. Gibbon's conversion at Rome was not a religious conversion of that sort. Neither the Christian God nor Jupiter sowed the seed of the decline and fall. Gibbon's conversion was, however, concerned with religion. It was friars praising a new God where an old God once presided, not the ruins of the Capitol alone, that struck him. Gibbon traced the genesis of his great work to a vision of the world's having turned from one religion to another. And here was the crucial thing, at least for me at that time. Gibbon didn't sneer at the phenomenon of conversion, as he was commonly thought to sneer at everything having to do with Christianity. Gibbon, the autobiographer, attempted to embed conversion in a secular personal history while preserving the phenomenon, not denying its power or otherwise explaining it away. Was it possible that the decline and fall, for all of its skepticism, constituted an analogous attempt by Gibbon the historian? So that's the question that motivated Gibbon's Christianity, this book that's now slowly winding its way through the press. As you may have already guessed, my answer to that question is yes. I think Gibbon was concerned not merely to oppose Christianity, but to confront it as a philosophical and historical problem. Like a number of near contemporaries, Gibbon developed a rich psychology of religion as part of an effort to understand Christianity's historical role. While Gibbon was undoubtedly a non-believer in Christian doctrine, let me just stress that point, he did not have Christian faith. He was not at bottom contemptuous of it. He developed a way of kind of appreciating it with, again, a kind of subtlety and sympathy that I think we can stand to appreciate. So anyway, in the book on Gibbon, let me just frame this chapter now. I make that case in two parts. In the first two chapters of the book, in part one, which I won't belabor here, I explore the run-up to the conversion experience of October 15th, 1764. I have lots to say about the history of the religious autobiography, the history of the travelogue from ancient times to the 17th and 18th centuries. I explain how Gibbon tried to make sense of his own early experiences of Christianity in the memoirs, his diaries, his correspondence. But the upshot of all of that is my claim that what's most compelling and least dismissive in Gibbon's treatment of religion appears when we approach the decline and fall from the context surrounding its conception. And again, the point is not to reduce the work to the context, of course, but just that there's an element of the decline and fall that comes to light with particular clarity when we approach it in that way. The second part of Gibbon's Christianity turns to Gibbon's texts, and that's a part that you've read a chapter of. In the book's third chapter, I look at Gibbon's first book, the essay Sur l'étude de la littérature, which he published in French in 1761. Gibbon's immediate goal in the essay is to defend classical erudition against the attacks, as he perceived them, of French philosophers. In the course of making that case, Gibbon defends and defines philosophical history, which he understands as the ability to discern the general causes of human action and to balance those against particular causes and chance. He also confronts Christianity publicly for the first time and develops two ideas that mature into central themes in the decline and fall. The first is the cyclical theory of political development, that Gibbon discovers in ancient authors, but really makes his own in this essay, and then proceeds to use in the decline and fall. The basic idea is that poor, pure peoples acquire empire by conquering rich, corrupt peoples. In doing so, the poor and pure grow rich and corrupt until they are themselves conquered by the pure and poor. The second idea that he develops in the essay and then carries forward is a theory of religion. Which is basically this. He says that gods are initially personifications of nature rather than deified human beings. And worship of them reflects not only man's primal fear of the surrounding world, but gratitude and admiration for the surrounding world, the natural world around him. Both theories, that the cyclical theory of political development and that theory of religion, inform Gibbon's mature approach to Roman politics and the rise of Christianity and the decline and fall. All right, so the next chapter in the work is the one you've read, so I won't say anything about that. I'll just maybe highlight two things about it. It's quite late in volume one that Gibbon talks about Christianity, which suggests, as I have said in the chapter, that I think he thinks you can explain the decline and get pretty close to the fall without having to enter Christianity as a cause of what happened. And then I talk also about the way he introduces the reader to thinking about priestly religion with these study abroad trips he takes to Persia and Germany. And then in the book's final chapter, just to give you where it goes after the chapter you've read, I look at the general observations of the fall of the Roman Empire in the West, which is a short text that Gibbon drafted before he started to write The Decline and Fall, and then inserted as a kind of coda after the third volume, which was published in 1781, along with the second volume of the work. In the general observation, Gibbon considers what lessons his own age might learn from the history of Rome's decline, and he draws a very surprising conclusion. He says the division of Europe into independent states sharing religion, language, and manners allows modernity to escape the ancient cycle of empire. Christianity, he says, contributes to this condition, quote, productive of the most beneficial consequences to the liberty of mankind by enabling a form of union that transcended and tolerated political divisions. So just the upshot of that is that this element of Christianity's effect on politics that a lot of authors, Gibbon's contemporaries, his predecessors, criticize, that it separates religion in a sense from politics and dissolves this union that a lot of authors admire in Roman paganism. Gibbon ends up saying that has a salutary effect, at least historically, because it allows for a kind of cultural union that's consistent with political division. So states can rise and fall in Europe, for instance, without imperiling civilization as a whole, which he thinks happened in Rome. About all those themes, there's a lot more to be said, obviously, than what I've said here and what I say in the book, for that matter, too. I talk about the entirety of the Decline and Fall in the manuscript in the book, but I really focus on the first volume that came out in 1776 and some important parts of the second and third volumes that came out in 1781. But the overriding goal of that is basically to mark out a line of approach to Gibbon's text that facilitates our learning from Gibbon about Christianity and its influence on the development of the modern world. Also, tries to revive this cyclical theory, which I think is interesting and relevant to us, and sort of explore what Gibbon meant by philosophical history, which is another idea that I think has some purchase on us. So with that, I'll stop. I think I've gone on a little bit too long. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Great, thanks very much, Hugh. I'm looking forward to it too. It's a wonderful paper. I've got the Decline and Fall fresh in my mind from having just taught chapters 1 through 16 to my undergraduates, and I'm full of questions. That said, I'm going to try and sit on my hands for a little bit and open up to the floor more generally. If you have a question, you can do it really either one of two ways. At BC, we do tend to use, this year, we've used the raise hand function. So I can recognize you through that. If you're more comfortable simply writing in the chat screen that you have a question, that's another way to easily be recognized. So either using the raise hand or the chat function should be fine for our purposes. But with that, I will open it up. Yes, great. I believe that we have straight from Houston. I think Aline has a question to start us off here.
Yes, thank you. I have actually, well, I have more, but I will stick with two. One is, while reading, I really enjoyed it. I started being a little bit like confused in the beginning, but I got into it the more I progressed into the chapter. So I really enjoyed reading it. What I'm not exactly clear about is like, would you suggest that he was doing some sort of intentional writing between the lines kind of thing about Christianity in particular? For example, page 31, the pervasive content and irony of Gibbon's account of Christianity has had the ironic effect of hiding from most of his readers his penetrating analysis, we must almost say appreciation of Christianity's power. There are several other instances in which you kind of suggest that he was doing intentionally some sort of esoteric writing, writing between the lines type of thing. So that's my first question. Do you think he did it intentionally, or you are just extracting something that was there but was not necessarily something that he did intentionally? And if it was intentionally, why? Because obviously it cannot be because of his fear of being condemned for his anti-Christianity, which, as you actually state, he was convinced he will be. So it's not that. So he wants to present himself as an anti-Christian while sending an kind of esoteric message that actually Christianity is not so bad. That's the part I kind of confused about. And okay, I'll keep another one for maybe later if you have enough time. But what I'm not very familiar. I mean, I read some Gibson, but not enough. So my question is like, what is he's thinking about the British Empire compared with republics or states in Europe? Is he making, that's just a very particular question. Is he making any distinction between Great Britain and, let's say, France or what have you, which were not empire at the time?
Yeah, thanks. So I love the first question. So I'd like to answer that first, and then I'll take what he thought about the British Empire. Yeah, so this is a weird kind of esotericism, right? So you expect him, to maybe hide his unbelief. That's like the secret teaching. And I'm kind of making this weird argument that he's pretty explicit, more or less about his unbelief, and is like esoterically, I guess, writing between lines, saying that Christianity actually has this kind of, I mean, admirable, I suppose. It's at least a very effective way of gaining power in the context that and it represents a kind of strength, and it kind of rehabilitates on a different plane, in a different form, some of the virtues like discipline, union, a kind of patriotism, right, that the early republic had and he admires, right? So yeah, it's a weird kind of esotericism. Let me say what I think he's doing first, and then maybe comment on like how it fits within other kinds of esoteric writing. First of all, I think he's actually pretty explicit about what he thinks about Christianity, right? So I don't think it's like a secret teaching or anything. I think he has a way of kind of introducing the reader to it, which uses some very subtle ways of writing. Like I excavate some of the footnotes, for instance, early on to show you that when he's praising Roman polytheism, he's actually kind of like hinting to you that something more is going to come down the lane. But that's, I don't know how esoterical that is, because he ends up saying exactly, what he thinks about the weakness of Roman polytheism. I think what he has to do, though, is that he has to convey to his reader a certain skepticism about Christian doctrine before he can educate his reader and to understand what's really going on with the rise of Christianity. So I think if he's working with a reader who thinks that the rapid spread of Christianity, is like testimony to the way that God has favored it, as an instance of providence kind of moving in this world, that reader is not going to be as open to the kind of secular causes that are much more interesting, in fact, that account for why Christianity spread as it did. So I think he's both explicit about his, like, I mean, not exactly explicit, but like close enough, about his skepticism as a way of kind of winning a hearing ultimately for the account of Christianity that he gives, which, is a little more favorable maybe than we realize if we just focus on his infidelity. So that's one thing. And then just a quick comment on the kind of like varieties of esotericism. I mean, there are these passages, like Plutarch example is Solon, where he tells the truth after acting that he's crazy. And there are other examples of people like saying the thing that they really believe, while acting in such a way that they're going to be dismissed. I think that's, like Gibbon kind of says exactly what he means, actually, is my read of him on the reasons for Christianity, but just in such a way that it's allowed it to be dismissed by a certain kind of reader who's going to focus more on the infidelity.
So just to clarify, are you saying he's not doing intentionally esoteric writing, but more like intentionally pedagogical writing?
Yeah. No, I think it's pedagogical, that's right. Not a fear of persecution, but pedagogical. No, thanks, that's helpful. About the British Empire, it's remarkable that he doesn't have more to say about it. One of the reasons that I wanted to write a chapter on the general observations to conclude my own, little work on Gibbon is that, you would kind of expect him. I mean, every reader basically from 1776 on has drawn implications for how to understand contemporary political bodies based on what Gibbon lays out in The Decline and Fall. And it's shocking the degree to which Gibbon, apart from a few allusions here and there, and even those you kind of have to stretch, I think, in the text of The Decline and Fall to make them apply to Britain, it's shocking the degree to which he's not willing to extend his argument to the British Empire. And then in the general observations, actually, denies that you can properly extend the argument in any kind of direct way to the decline of the British Empire, or at least to the European state system. That's really what he wants to say, is that there's something new in modernity that comes as kind of a legacy of the Christian impact on politics that allows modernity writ large, anyhow, to escape the cycle. But he's very reluctant, I think, on my reading of him anyway, to draw those kind of analogies. It's particularly striking, given that he's as involved as he is in the politics of the British Empire, as he's writing this work, particularly Volume 1. I mean, he's a member of Parliament starting in 1774. He's very close to all of the people who are steering British policy, well, to Lord North in particular, but some others too, who are steering British policy in response to the American Revolution. He occasionally will playfully talk about it. Like at one point he says, having deliberated on the policy that's going to save the British Empire, I now turn to destroy the Roman Empire, in a letter to his friend Holyrod. So he'll do that kind of stuff. But in terms of like really spelling out what one means for the other, he tends to avoid doing that.
And do you have an explanation for I mean, it seems obvious that this kind of parallel should come to your mind, right? And to
Yeah.
the mind of his readers. And supposedly he knew that. So why didn't he pursue, or at least mention it more, or pursue this venue?
Yeah, I think maybe give one or two answers. One is that, you know, like all ambitious, vainglorious, or, you know, justifiably proud authors, right? He has in mind a much larger audience than the one that's immediately in front of him. And so there's something kind of parochializing about writing about just the British Empire. You know, it's going to be obsession for all times or close to that. So you don't want to tie it too closely to the present. So that's one, I mean, you know, kind of explanation for it, I guess. Another, though, is that he really does want us to think, and this, I think, comes out most clearly in the general observations about the disanalogies between modern politics and ancient politics, and you know, drawing too close of a parallel or commenting too much on contemporary politics, at least in the text of Decline and Fall, you know, would sort of take away from that.
Great. Thanks very much for that back and forth. The questions are now starting to stack up here a little bit. Let's hear from first my BC colleague, Amy Nenza, and then we also have a question from Jeff Church.
Yes, thank you. I admire your willingness to take on two such big books. So it's very impressive. As far as I can tell, I have a very particular question about the beginning of the Decline and Fall. And as far as I can tell, it's the first mention of religion, other than his reference to Christianity in the opening sentence, as you quite nicely point out. And it has to do with the military establishment of the Roman emperors. And it's, I don't know, I'll just read it to you so that, because it's hard to locate it with my volume. But he says, on his first entrance into the service, an oath was administered to him, a soldier, with every circumstance of solemnity. He promised never to desert his standard, to submit his own will to the commands of his leaders, and to sacrifice his life for the safety of the emperor and the empire. The attachment of the Roman troops to their standards was inspired by the united influence of religion and of honor. The golden eagle, which glittered in the front of the legion, was the object of their fondest devotion, nor was it esteemed less impious than it was ignominious to abandon that sacred ensign in the hour of danger. And he has a footnote. He says, to Tacitus calls the Roman eagles the gods of war. They were placed in a chapel in the camp, and with the other deities received the religious worship of the troops. And that seems just very unique and interesting. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on, especially considering where you work, you know, how odd that is for that level of piety. I don't know if it's similar to the Spartans or not, but I know it's very different from the Athenians. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I have thought about that a lot, actually, because Gibbon's, the account of why the Roman Empire lasts for as long as it does, you know, part of the explanation is that the legions managed to stay quite strong and you know, virtuous, tough, you know, for a long time, even when everything around them is becoming corrupt. So, you know, it reminds me of the end of Huntington's Soldier in the State, which he apparently got in a lot of trouble for, but it's a book we read with some piety around here at West Point. But he describes West Point as a little bit of Sparta in the midst of Babylon. And so I've thought a lot about this passage and taught it to cadets, actually, and had good conversations about it. With the question being just like, how much can the military maintain kind of internal to itself a culture that's different than the you know, state that it serves? And it's a deep challenge, actually. It's one that Huntington, you know, this book, at least among scholars of civil military relations, is not super popular these days, but it's still popular here, and I think a profound study. But it is one that Huntington thinks a lot about, and it's one that Gibbon thinks a lot about too. And as you said, This passage is really beautiful about it. So his explanation, Gibbon's explanation, as I understand it, is that you have these motives that the military is capable of sustaining on its own. They have to do with honor, religion, a kind of veneration for the object that symbolizes the cohesiveness of the unit, this eagle. This might be similar to the way that units today, have special patches that they venerate and flags, that they venerate. He also, Gibbon, is very sensitive to the way that the units of the imperial army develop their own kind of cultures particular to the unit. This seems to me to have, clear analogies in the contemporary military, at least American military. I don't know so much about other militaries, in the way that, units like the airborne units or the 75th Ranger Regiment, like, develop their own tradition. Like they know where that unit was on D-Day, for instance, So I think that Gibbon is alive to the way that the military, and we might say other kind of, sub-communities, I guess, in the state, can maintain a set of virtues that's quite different than the overall one. And the story, it really, over the course of volume 1, and it continues, is how these legions lose this, lose the ability to maintain an independent sense of honor, religion, of discipline. That's a key term in Gibbon. And end up kind of looking more or less like the state surrounding them. So it can't last forever, but it does last to a surprising degree for a long time.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. Jeff Church.
Hey, Hugh, thanks for the paper. I don't know Gibbon well, so this is more of a general question about how, I guess you could say, Gibbon's view of the genealogy of Christianity sort of compares with some other ones that are maybe more familiar. I'm thinking, maybe most proximate to Gibbon would be Hume, and how, Hume's Natural History of Religion, for example, traces out psychological causes for how humanity developed from a polytheistic state to a theistic state. And I gathered from your paper that Gibbon was rather influenced by Hume. So I didn't know if, how exactly, maybe, it seems like he departed from Hume's, as we know, Hume doesn't have a very sunny view of religion. So he departed from Hume, and maybe in what way? And then I was thinking, also in terms of, because Hume abstracts in large part in that work from the political emergence of Christianity. I mean, I was thinking of a couple of other theses, like, for example, one that we associate with, say, Hegel or Tocqueville, in which, the rise of Christianity is associated with a kind of continuity with imperial Rome. That imperial Rome has a certain character where you have a centralization of power with a big, despotic rule and a mass of individuals. And so Christianity is kind of the spiritualization of that relationship. And then on the other hand, you have someone like Nietzsche, who offers a kind of inversion of that take, where the idea is that Christianity isn't the continuation of sort of Rome, but it's the revaluation or inversion of it. So I maybe just help in terms of, how does Gibbon sort of stand vis-a-vis these different kind of counts of the emergence of Christianity? What's distinctive about him, I guess, in contrast to these?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. That's a great question, and maybe I can try just to answer very directly first, and then explain later. So I think it's the opposite of Nietzsche's account. I think Gibbon thinks that the empire has already gone quite far in transvaluing, reversing the values of the pagan world before Christianity comes on the scene and makes any real impact. So I think he's telling a different story than Nietzsche. I think Gibbon eventually gets around to something like the Tocquevillian Hegelian point, but he puts that the point at which Christianity starts to resemble the empire much later than they would, I think. I speak a little bit more about Tocqueville, who was fresher in mind than Hegel. So Gibbon's story is that Christianity kind of functions like a version of the Republic, rises to power, becomes a state religion, until very late looks more like a Confederate Republic than it does like, the kind of the papacy, the kind of imitation of the Roman Empire. But, it does eventually take on that form. you know, but again, like the origin is never quite lost. You know, it's not, that's not the whole story, I guess, about it, that it's just kind of mimicking what the Roman Empire is doing. About Hume, like I think the distinction I draw with Hume is, you know, has more to do with that kind of political origin story, I think, than anything else. I mean, Gibbon venerates Hume. You know, they know each other. Gibbon frequently sends his work to Hume, including works he was trying out before the Decline and Fall, like the History of the Liberty of the Swiss. I think in 1767 he sends to Hume, and Hume writes him, gives him some great feedback on it right away. You know, a month later, and you know, Gibbon eventually abandons it. Hume also sends, you know, a very nice praise of the first volume of Decline and Fall before he dies, which Gibbon really treasures. So the relationship there is very close, but I think, you know, I'd say the difference is that Gibbon wants to highlight not only kind of fear, you know, in the origin of Christian theology, like the passion, the passion of the origin of the thing. And then it seems to me that this kind of political account of how the early Christians, you know, form the union with one another is, you know, it strikes me as distinctive to Gibbon, but I say this without having, you know, Hume as fresh in mind as perhaps I should.
Great. Thank you for that. We've got two questioners in the queue now, Nasser Benegar and then Bob Faulkner. Nasser? Nasser, I think you're muted.
Can you hear me? Good. Yeah, thank you very much for your paper. Having read it, I came to this conclusion, which I'm not sure whether it is your conclusion or not. To the question of what caused the fall of the Roman Empire, it seems that Gibbon's answer is that there were two causes. First, classical philosophy that trained the Roman elites who were unable to suppress Christianity. And second, Christianity, which did the great damage afterwards. I think your paper argues the first part, and you don't address the second part. So I don't know whether you accept the second part of the, or you think that's just not true with regard to Gibbons.
Yeah, I don't think the second part is true, Nasser. I'm sorry that it gave that impression. The first,
I'm sorry, I didn't think that was the impression, but I think that's the general impression that people have of Gibbon history. So yeah, good.
No, fair enough. Okay, good. Well, I retract my apology then. Yes, I'm arguing against that impression of Gibbon. That's one of the things I'm trying to do. So in a sentence, what causes the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, according to Gibbon, is the corruption of the Roman elite that stems from excessive prosperity and security. So I think it's a cyclical theory of what drives states to rise, that they're tough, manly, hard, acquisitive, and fall. That once they acquire, they get soft, and then eventually stop fighting. Don't have the ability to kind of sustain what they've acquired, and so the whole fabric, he says, this is the word to use, the whole building kind of implodes on itself. But I think that doesn't require him to refer in any way to Christianity, and in fact he doesn't. He says Christianity is a circumstance that is a cause that kind of comes in to account for the particular way in which this empire falls. But what's most interesting to him, I think, is the way that Christianity allows Rome to survive itself. The barbarians end up converting to Christianity, and then because a kind of union is maintained among distinct political states, there's this wonderful historical achievement that he's looking at in front of him, the kind of shared culture, manners, all of that of Europe, even amidst political division, that can come into being. So that's a very salutary effect of Christianity, even though it's not the same thing as Christianity. So I think it's that really corrupting effect ultimately that's the cause of the fall. Now the Platonic, education, or this kind of philosophical education of the Roman elite, it does have something to do with it, because I think on Gibbon's understanding, it makes the magistrates of Rome less capable of entering into the mindset of an enthusiast. than they otherwise might be. I think that's the key thing, is that they, it sets them up to use religion as a tool of the state, which, Gibbon sees that it can be a very effective tool of the state. He doesn't want to deny that. But when it comes to setting them up to comprehending what religion is for a real believer, someone who will sacrifice and organize around that, and that sort of thing, and enacting the kinds of policies that could, limit it, control that. I think Gibbon thinks that, the kind of, the second, third order Platonism harms the ability of the Roman magistrates to do that. So that plays a role, but the fundamental driver is the corruption of the Roman elites. Yeah,
but there is a little bit of a tension between this explanation and your general thesis, that if philosophy prevented the Roman magistrates to understand enthusiasm, and enthusiasm is not a problem with Rome, then philosophy would not be a problem, right?
One more time, Nasser?
Yeah. So if classical philosophy created elites who could not understand fanatics or enthusiasts, and if Christianity is not the cause of the Roman problem, then this particular failure of Roman elites would be insignificant, right?
Insignificant with the view to the effect of Rome declines and falls. Yes, I think that's right, and that's helpful, because that's an implication of my argument that I don't spell as much. But you're absolutely right. So then my case is not that Christianity leads to the decline and fall, and that if the Roman elites had been, more sensitive to enthusiasm and all the rest of that, and had enacted the kind of religious persecution that we in fact see in Persia and Gibbon's understanding, that the Roman Empire would have lasted forever. I certainly don't want to say that. So it's well taken. So it's only in the sense that Christianity, is not the fundamental driver, but characterizes, the effects, I guess, of the decline and fall, that the Roman elites' kind of blindness to it matters. That's right. But I don't also want to say that if their blindness to it caused the decline and fall. I don't think that's true.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Nasser, for the question here. We have next up in the queue, Bob Faulkner.
Hugh, it's very nice to see you.
See you too, Bob.
A very fine paper.
Thank you.
Well argued and with attention to many and diverse sources. My question is somewhat abstract in view of your general topic. It's this. You state that in the analysis of religion, the modern analysis is not adequate, deriving it from fear, and that he respects something of the ancient analysis, including including wonder in our psychology. I just wondered if you would clarify the relation between those two things. That is to say, what is the relation between religion and our sense of wonder?
Thank you, Bob. What a wonderful question. I feel both fear and wonder at your question. So let me reflect on my sentiments. Honestly, I don't really know how to answer your question from Gibbon's perspective, so I can just give you, I guess, my own piddling perspective. So just remind you, it's not the perspective of the Department of Defense. But no, I think that what Gibbon is tracking is the way that, when we face up to nature, we sense something that's immensely larger, more powerful than ourselves, something that, doesn't necessarily have our best interests in view. At least that's not how it immediately appears to us, but at the same time has a kind of beauty and order to it that we can't help but, admire and want to understand better. So I think, this kind of, I don't know whether to call it primal. It seems to me like it's more accurate to say that it's an experience of nature that I feel like sometimes I have access to. I don't know whether I can safely say that this is like a human experience, but that all people have or whatever, that it's like what Gibbon's tracking. But it does seem to me that when you look at something that has an order to it, that you can comprehend and appreciate, but not fully grasp, that the proper relationship is a mixture of fear and wonder. And it would be not correct, I think, to describe it simply as fear, because fear just suggests a kind of hostility maybe to what you want to do. And it's not quite that. There's a kind of satisfaction and sense of beauty in the way you behold it. So anyway, that's my best effort. But does that get after what you're talking about? I would love to hear your thoughts on that too.
No, I just have in mind, no, I don't think I can add anything to that. I like your remarks. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Bob. We actually have an open queue, so I'm emboldened now to ask a question of my own, which will be much less heady than Bob's question and probably much more deeper in the weeds, as it were. But I have to say, as somebody that's been working on the text and teaching the text recently, I was blown away by the paper. I really think it's a remarkable paper for two particular reasons. One is I was really impressed by, and you opened up some significant daylight between Tacitus's treatment of the German barbarians and Gibbon's, and that forces me to rethink some things that even in the way I've approached teaching it. And so I'm very grateful for that. I also think you do a masterful job of addressing, I'm sort of perversely inclined to say, Gibbon's reverence towards Christianity, at least understood as his respect and regard for its power. And now here's the but. So I find your treatment of the forces that led your treatment of Gibbon's treatment of the forces that promoted the rise of Christianity really remarkable. That's chapter 15. What I don't see much of in this chapter, and perhaps the very simple response is you do it elsewhere in the manuscript, but I don't see much of chapter 16. And that is, of course, the Roman counter-reaction, the persecution that fueled martyrdom, that led to the coalescing around the Universal Republic or the Christian Republic, and the rise of the power of the Pope. And so I wonder how much of that story needs to be brought in, if only to say, yes, Gibbon admires to some degree, perhaps some profound degree, the power of the forces that led Christianity to rise from within. But doesn't he also want to explain much of that by the counter-reaction that fueled the fires, by the Romans abandoning their position on toleration that they had given towards polytheism before and becoming active persecutors? So the sort of too long version of the question, or the short version of a too long question, is simply chapter 16. What role does it play in the larger project?
Thanks, Ryan. That's a great question. So I wish I could say, I totally answered that question in another part of the book. But alas, no, I don't say a whole lot about it. And it's a comment that a reviewer of the manuscript pointed out too. So there's actually a little bit more about chapter 16 than there was on the first draft of this thing as a result of that. But it's a great question. Let me say, I think that your point about you fueling the fire, in the way that the attempts, the kind of futile attempts at persecution actually make Christianity stronger. That is anticipated in chapter 15 with the idea that, that Christians are kind of surrounded all the time by enemies, and this forces them to always be on the defense, to their spirit is kind of always roused, and they're ready to go. And this actually is a really powerful form of sustaining their union. So I think in a way that idea from chapter 15 is just kind of like elaborated in chapter 16. So that's a kind of excuse, I guess, for not having more to say about it. But honestly, the reason I don't do a whole lot with it is I think that chapter 16, it's obviously important, Gibbon means every word of it, but I think it kind of like, it sustains this traditional reading that leads to an underappreciation of the argument in chapter 15 that I find so interesting and neglected. And that's why rhetorically it plays a slightly lesser role. I think chapter 16 is also, and I do talk a little bit about this, I don't remember whether it's in the chapter I gave you guys or in another part of the manuscript, so maybe I can't play that card here. But I talk a little bit about some of the contemporary resonance of chapter 16. This is a place, I think it was Elaine, and forgive me for using everyone's first name when I've just met you, but anyway. But you're asking about like what kind of lessons Gibbon himself is drawing for the present. And one lesson that he absolutely wants to draw is to condemn religious war. And the way that fanaticism, enthusiasm, all of these other things can form, people who just are willing to slaughter each other. He thinks that's very bad, that this is something that we can genuinely admire about Roman polytheism, even if it does have certain blind spots. They weren't doing this. So that's a big kind of takeaway from chapter 16, is that that this it's not that the causes are new, because people were killing each other, obviously, and fighting over things, and it's not. But there's a kind of I don't know, hard edge to it, a kind of lack of humanity that Gibbon thinks enters into the world with these religious motives. And he definitely wants to spell it out. So the chapter ends, for instance, in pointing out just the numbers, how many more people die in even a fairly minor religious war than die, in the whole Roman persecution of Christianity. But it is a bit of an oversight. It's more or less an intentional oversight, Ryan, but I fully accept that it would probably do a stronger work if I had a more thorough account in there.
Well, great. I appreciate the answer. And I just want to say for the record, I was not reviewer number one that made that comment. That is not me doubling down on frustration or anything. We're just thinking along the same line. Yeah. Right. We have, we do have a couple of repeat questioners coming in. I suppose it'd be good if someone hasn't yet asked a question to get in the queue. And Jeff, will you remind me, do we have a hard cutoff limit in terms of time?
No, we don't have a hard cutoff limit. We typically go an hour and a half. But no.
Okay. All right. So we have plenty of time here. So with that in mind, let's go back. I know that Alina even introduced early on saying that he had 2 questions in mind and had the self-command to hold back the second question. But why don't we hear the second question now? And then we also have Amy Nenza with the second question in the queue.
And it's actually the third one. And I'll hold on the fourth one. So, I'll come back to one of your arguments about not talking about the British Empire because of the difference between the ancient, or let's say classic politics, and modern politics, and because it's like it's a gap between the two, which first of all, I don't really buy into this argument, because he talks about Tacitus, for example. He will be relevant for centuries to come, and so on and so forth. And I think he was pretty proud of himself. So I assume he was trying to write something that is not just was relevant only for the past, but also for the future. Therefore, the gap between classic politics, for the lack of a better word, and modern politics, I don't think it was so big into his mind. Which brings me to a more general question, which you mentioned briefly in the beginning of your talk, which was the parallel, because now I'm selfish, because it's something I'm working on as well. The parallel between the type of the soul and the type of the regime. You mentioned it briefly at the beginning of your talk, and it was commonly accepted, right, until the beginning of modernity at the very least, and probably a little bit even later. But so my question now is, speaking of this transition from, or lack of, between classical and modern, wouldn't you think that basically this lack of accepting as a kind of like bottom line that there are some parallels between the type of the soul and the types of the regimes, which disappears now? It is not serious to talk about that, right? But it's basically rephrased and repackaged in a different way. So it's basically old wine in new skins. I'm thinking now about identity politics and so on and so forth. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think we should still talk about the parallel between the soul and the regime. I think it's, Tocqueville is, I imagine a lot of our great teacher in how to do that, to think about the way that democratic souls kind of mirror, democracy in certain respects. So to me, that's a very, live idea that I would want to hold on to. So I think I can just agree with you on that point, and then maybe you can refine if I'm missing something about that. But let me just say precisely how I understand Gibbon to be speaking about the gap between ancient and modern, because I think I agree with a lot of what you said. I mean, Tacitus, he absolutely understands to be relevant for all time. He says, Tacitus elucidates human nature. He uses that word, and that's precisely why he's always going to be relevant to us, You know, and Gibbon doesn't hesitate to say that the human heart is the same always and everywhere, you know, and insofar as Hume, along the lines of what Jeff said, he cites Hume as a guide to the human heart. And so Hume is going to be relevant, you know, to ancient politics, understanding ancient politics. So he absolutely he has that like a kind of perennialist, you know, discovery of nature, you know, that's constant between antiquity and modernity in him. What he thinks is new, and in this precise sense, this is new, is the ability to share culture simultaneous with political division, right? So that's not a revolution in what human beings are, right? It's not, it could be a revolution in a bunch of other stuff, but it's really a change in, I think, in political arrangement. We might describe it as a change of institutions or something like that. But that's what he, at least in the general observations, but I think this really runs throughout the book. That's what he thinks is new. So can you use then this theory of, you know, of rise and fall, of you know, hard peoples rising by acquiring and then getting corrupt and all that? Can you use that to explain particular nations and their development? I think absolutely. And Gibbon, I don't think, would hesitate to say that you could. So if you wanted to understand the development of a particular nation, could you use that theory? You sure could, I think he would say. Now, so he wants to use that theory to explain the political development of a particular nation. I don't think he wants to use that theory to account for like the development of, let's say, Europe as a whole, right? This kind of civilization that contains within it a bunch of political bodies that will behave according to that cycle. Then the question is, where does the British Empire fall? Is it more like Europe, you know, which contains a lot of distinct things that could each have their own trajectories, and there's some kind of overarching thing that sustains itself, even though there's this particular motion to the parts? Or is it more like a nation, you know, in which case the overall thing is going to have this trajectory? I don't know of a place in Gibbon where he decides on that issue. He's very interested in thinking about the different forms of confederal government. He suggested a few points in describing Rome, that if Rome had been able to establish something more like a confederal government, in other words, a form of union that was consistent with real substantial political division, that maybe, you know, it would have lasted a lot longer than it did. So maybe he would be kind of open to that sort of an arrangement, which, you know, people are already talking about during his time as one potential solution to the American problem. You know, so I don't know, and it might be, you know, that there's some corner of Gibbon that I haven't explored, as I think one of the previous questioners said. You know, it's a vast you know, corpus. But I hope that's clear. So Europe as a whole is going to be immune to these ancient forces, but it's because of the way that, you know, culture is shared even while political division remains.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Aline, for questions 3 and 4, I believe is where we are now, keeping track. Great questions all. Let's get Amy in here for question number 2.
Yeah, this is a little bit of a follow-up on Ryan, because I too was very impressed with the distinction you made between Tacitus and Gibbon, because I was just sort of overwhelmed by Gibbon's very high praise of Tacitus, and I hadn't made that comparison. But I have a question about your impression, how you would rate the two actually, because my experience, I read Gibbon a couple of years ago, and I've just been recently reading the annals, Tacitus's annals and the histories, and I'm much more impressed by Tacitus's the depth of his analysis of the relation between religion and politics, and the whole and the decline of the empire. I mean, to the extent that he covers what happens between the Augustus, and which is really a devastating account of how corrupt and rotten Rome has become. By the time that Gibbon is giving high praise to the later period, where the empire seems to have come back from the depths of Nero and Caligula. And so I wonder if you have any, I'm just blown away by Tacitus and Gibbon. I'm a little bit, he leaves me wanting. I think it just doesn't quite seem to have the depth of Tacitus. I just wanted to get your personal impression.
I mean, I love Tacitus too, so I share that with you. I would never, really want to say that anything is, lacking in Tacitus. I mean, he's a beautiful writer, such concision, like, I just feel like just praising. But I mean, it does seem to me that out of Gibbon's engagement with Tacitus, and I just say, in general, Gibbon shares that view too. I mean, Tacitus is a philosophical historian who will be read for all time, according to Gibbon. I think in Gibbon's view, there are really like two kind of important items that Tacitus gets wrong, that aren't present in Tacitus in the way they should be, maybe because we don't have all of this text, like one is the possibility of imperial renewal, or like the way that within a broadly like downward arc, there can be these moments of real brilliance, resurgence. I mean, Tacitus obviously wouldn't have been ignorant of that. I mean, I think like Syme's work on Tacitus I really love, and I think he's right that Tacitus has in view, like in front of his own eyes, really that happening, and wants to facilitate it, happening some more, right? Sustaining these kind of moments of renewing the empire. But in the works that come down to us anyway, we don't have that as clearly on display as all the misery and the corruption, and all of that. So I think that I make this case in the paper. I might be repeating myself, but I think Gibbon is much more interested in that phenomenon, at least, than Tacitus in the text we have of his. Shows himself to be. But it's almost certainly because we don't have all the text. But the second point I think is maybe more interesting, that in this stuff on the Germans, like, I started from this position too, that Gibbon just venerates Tacitus, and it was only by really going through the texts, really getting into the weeds of the text, that I started to notice these gaps. But they're significant. I mean, I think Gibbon thinks that there's much more plasticity, a kind of variety in human nature than Tacitus allows there to be. I mean, so when he makes these points about how Tacitus doesn't appreciate the effect that not being able to write things down has on the soul, that's a really substantial disagreement, I think. And I don't know if it's totally fair. I mean, Tacitus in the Germania, anyway, when he gets really up north, suggests that the people are these kind of like half human, half animal creatures, and so I don't know that it's necessarily a fair critique. But certainly, like as it applies to the German, tribes, like Gibbon wants to distinguish himself from Tacitus. And the bit about money is significant too. He thinks human beings are just a very different kind of creature unless they have these, these developments of civilization that allow them to develop kind of natural potentials, in ways that they wouldn't develop without those institutions, right? So a human being with money is one kind of creature. A human being without money is another kind of creature. Same thing with literacy, So I don't know. I mean, that strikes me as an important divergence. And if I had to pick sides on that, I mean, I don't know. I think I'm going with Gibbon on that one. That seems to be a plausible claim that there's really this difference, but it's a hard call. Tacitus is wonderful.
Well, one of the things that strikes me is the treatment of women and the role of women in the decline of the empire. And also, conversely, I think the role of women in the foundations of the empire. There's a very just interesting education of women in Rome that doesn't exist in other ancient societies. And maybe you can remind me, I just don't remember that being treated with any depth in Gibbon.
Oh, and Gibbon, I think Gibbon is really fascinated by strong women who rise and do good things in politics. And he's in fact, I think, a little less, I don't know. I guess this is maybe a matter of some controversy to think about saying it, but I was going to say a little less attentive than Tacitus to the ways that women in politics make everything just go downhill. I mean, Tacitus,
that's what I'm more interested in, is how bad they are.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's Philip, right? Philip the Arab, who one of these later, whose mother, Mamia, comes on the scene and does wonderful things, like really uses some power. But then, but out east, Gibbon finds some wonderful women to admire. So his description of Zenobia, as a kind of like second coming of Cleopatra, is really marvelous, and it strikes me as a place where Gibbon just seems to admire someone who can use political power well. He says that she goes to Rome and participates in the triumph in a way that Cleopatra, never would. And there's something to that, but he genuinely seems interested in that. He also comments actually on women in politics when he's discussing monarchy, at one point. This actually might be the same part of the book as Memia, where he says, that the women, because of hereditary monarchy, have held power and have used it well in European history, right? So he acknowledges that. He refers to Catherine a few times along those lines. So yeah, so I read Gibbon to be, I don't exaggerate it, right? But he certainly is open to the possibility that women can play a positive role in political life.
But it's the decline on the question of your topic of religion, it's the decline of family, piety, and sexual mores that Tacitus is extremely focused on. And I don't know if that plays the relation between the religion plays such an important role in family life, which is the foundation of politics. And Tacitus is extremely aware of this, and I don't know that Gibbon has that same concern.
Yeah, it's not as prominent. I mean, I guess an easy way of saying it would be that what Tacitus finds to admire in the Germans, Gibbon finds to admire in the early Christians. But honestly, he doesn't make as much as you would want him to make of the more restrictive sexual morality vis-a-vis the quite licentious, sexual morality of the Romans, as he would need to, I think, to bear out that interpretation. I will say, though, that Gibbon is critical in a certain sense. I mean, he's not a social conservative, Gibbon is, but he, but he does take certain kinds of sexual practice to be illustrative of the things that are going wrong in Rome. So with the Heliogabalus, this emperor who starts cross-dressing, he thinks that's bad. He says at one point that the number of eunuchs at court is he almost makes it a social science theory, as many eunuchs as there are at court. Far down the decline has gone, right? You can kind of imagine a graph that showed that. So those are kind of Tacitian elements, I guess. But it's not as accentuated in Gibbon as it is in Tacitus. I think that's safe to say.
Okay, thank you.
With the queue open, I wonder, Hugh, if you might not expand on that sort of remark, and maybe it was just a throwaway line at the end, but when you suggested that Gibbon is not a social conservative, I might be inclined to agree, but then that does prompt the obvious question, if not that, then what is he? And especially given the fact that you're dealing so explicitly and obviously with questions of religious persecution, religious toleration, if he's not a social conservative, in light especially of the religion questions, does it make sense to see him through the lens of Enlightenment liberalism, or is there something more complex going on here between those two poles?
Yeah, sorry, Brian, that was a throwaway line that I now have to own, I guess, a little bit. Yeah, I don't know. I guess what I meant is that he's not quite as interested in sexual morality as maybe you'd expect, And it's an element of his reception too, which is kind of interesting to me, that sexual morality plays a big role in the decline and fall. And I don't think that's borne out nearly as much in the text as it is by certain readers, as much as it's stressed by certain readers of Gibbon. But yeah, so where does Gibbon fall, I guess, on this? I mean, look, he's a conservative, definitely, in the sense that he wants to start by defending the kind of old and good and established over against the new and revolutionary. So Gibbon opposes the American Revolution. He's different than Burke in that sense. He's much less open than Burke is to the value, the good of the American Revolution. He's with Lord North and all those guys. Gibbon opposes the French Revolution. There's some debate among Gibbon scholars about how quick he is to do this and whether this isn't covering his prior indiscretions or whatever. I tend to read him as a pretty consistently conservative figure in that sense of opposing revolution. I think in his letters, it's really clear that he anticipates that the French Revolution is going to go badly pretty much as soon as it gets started, and that he's kind of worked out a Burkean position before he ever reads Burke's Reflections on the Revolution. And he receives it quite enthusiastically because it kind of says everything he was thinking, and it more or less articulated in letters up to that point. So in that sense, a conservative, I mean, in this very, very, I guess kind of throwaway sense that maybe I shouldn't have even said, is he prudish in any way? No, I don't think he's prudish in any way, but that's the only sense in which that's true. Just on the French Revolution point, there's this one line that's kind of at the center of this debate among Gibbon scholars. where Gibbon says that he is in a letter that the question he was facing in like thinking about Roman polytheism and the rise of Christianity was whether or not to defend the established church. And he defended the established church, right? That's how you should understand his early praise of Roman polytheism. And I just think that's a nice kind of elision on his part of some of the issues he's dealing with in the 18th century, and the work he's writing about, or the period he's writing about.
Great. Yes, I think anybody, anyone that's read Gibbon's footnotes, especially the ones he leaves untranslated in Greek, knows that he is anything but a prude.
That's right.
Willing to transcribe certain things that do not fit prudishness. I owe knowing that to Ralph Lerner's tutelage here. We do have a little bit of time, so if anybody wants to jump in with the last question here, especially those we haven't heard from, we do have our open queue. So
right, I think it's only fair that I get to ask questions of people at some point, right? To turnabout. I mean, if no one else has questions for me, I would love to hear, Ryan, your reflections on Adam Smith and Gibbon. I'm sure you've thought a little bit about this, from the 1776 course. And then I just would love to hear Mr. Lerner in general, if he's willing to share with us, because he's really.
I have a. Well,
yeah, Elaine, sorry. I'll stop asking other people questions.
It's a very particular question, so I'm not sure how many people would be interested in. But I was just wondering, out of curiosity, when you say it's pages 6 and 7, Gibbon says the moderating hand of a supreme magistrate who, by the progress of knowledge and flattery, was gradually invested with the sublime perfections of an eternal parent and an omnipotent monarch, and the principles of theology and politics were of a piece. And later on, my guess is that he was pretty familiar with the first years of Christian literature, like starting with the apologetic literature, going on to John Chrysostom, right?
Yes.
So I was wondering, it's just a particular curiosity, is he using Eusebius of Caesarea, which makes the parallel between monotheism and monarchy and polytheism versus anarchy?
So yes, he's a very careful and close reader of Eusebius. That's absolutely true. Does he make that specific thing? Yeah, I think that's probably in his mind. I mean, I can't remember like with this specific passage if he's engaging Eusebius there or not. But I think in broad terms, yeah, he's drawing those kind of analogies between political life and theology, sure.
That's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
I have to read Gibbon again.
It's great. You can read Tacitus too. They're both great.
All right. Well, with our queue open here, we can leave it. If Ralph Lerner wants to take the bait, I would be particularly happy to hear his response to Hugh's invitation. Otherwise, I don't know if we have other questioners here on the line. And Hugh, watch what you ask for. You're opening the floodgates if you're asking me a question about Adam Smith here late on a Friday afternoon. I don't want to subject the innocent to that, but I would very happily stay on the line after the formal end of the call to talk until late into the evening if you're up for it.
All right, fair enough. I'll wait then.
All right. If we indeed don't have further questions, then we can break. But we certainly all owe Hugh our thanks for a lively presentation, really a wonderful paper, and what promises to be a very important book that I know I speak for many on this call when I say that we're very much looking forward to it. So Hugh, thank you very much for your time and sharing part of the Friday afternoon with us. And thanks too also for Jeff, who has done so much to get this up and running and gathering us together here. So thanks very much to you both.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks.